The first thing we're going to learn about is food chains. And food chains, as it says up there in those bullet points, show us the energy flow, or they show the feeding relationship, so what eats what and what is eaten by things. You don't always have pictures in them. I just had a bit of free time at lunchtime, so I decided to draw a couple of little pictures. What you'll often see them done as is just the words, so the names of the things. And this is the sort of thing we could expect to see in lots of ecosystems or habitats in New Zealand. Grass being eaten by rabbits, rabbits being eaten by kahu or hawks. And you'll notice that it starts with grass. And grass is not the same as these two. What's different about it? It's a plant. Fantastic. You'll notice that all food chains start with a plant, or you'll often see a word when you look up called phytoplankton. They're just microscopic plants, or what we call algae, that live in salty water, so in the oceans. And sometimes in lakes and things as well. And then the other one I've just said is algae, so sometimes you'll see they start with algae, A-L-G-A-E. We call these things producers because they actually produce their own food. So they actually make all of the food energy, what we call chemical potential energy, all of the food energy in this food chain. They make all of it that can be provided. But they use a lot of that energy to grow and to fix damaged cells and things like that. So it doesn't all get used for making the grass bigger. It gets used for actually doing other processes as well. Then the producers, sorry, I forgot something there. Where do you think the producers get all of their energy from? Because you can't make energy. The sunlight. Cool. And that's what we're going to get to in a moment when we talk about a thing called photosynthesis. You'll notice again I haven't put the sun in the food chain because the sun isn't food. Its energy gets transformed or turned into chemical energy by the grass. Okay.
Worms.
Sorry? I could put worms. That would be a different food chain altogether.
Because of the worms, we like take up and then the
True. And then they put stuff into the soil. That's to do with scavengers and decomposers, which we'll probably do in a later lesson because that's very important for two cycles called the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle, which we're going to do later. So that's good that you mentioned that. Okay, so the grass gets eaten by a whole lot of rabbits, and if you go somewhere like the Mackenzie country, you'll see the devastating effect that that's had. There's almost no green grass down there. How much energy, just roughly, do you think goes from the grass to the rabbit? How much of the grass's energy do you think the rabbit actually gets into its body to make it bigger and stronger? Most of it? 10%? 40%? Amongst those we have what scientists think is the right answer. One of those, either most of it, so I'll assume you meant about 90%. Is that fair call? 10% or 40%. Who votes for 90%? Who votes for 10%? Who votes for about 40%? Okay, interesting. Just for those that can't see because of the video, about half the class thought it was 40%. It's actually only about 10% of the energy goes into making the rabbit bigger.
That's what they eat a lot.
But also, some of that energy is used to help keep the rabbit warm. So the 10% is just to make the rabbit bigger and stronger. The rest of it is used either as waste, it can be waste, or it can be used to keep the rabbit warm, because it's what we call warm-blooded, control its own temperature. So guess how much of the rabbit's energy goes into making the kahu bigger? 1% of the grass's energy, or 1% of the rabbit's energy? Okay, bit of a trick question. It's actually the same. We think that it's about 10% of the energy that comes from eating the rabbit. But 10% of 10% is 1%. So of all of the grass that's been eaten, only 1% of that energy gets to the hawk. So it's only 1% of that energy, because it's 10% and 10% again. Those that are good at maths will be able to show me later how that's worked out. If the hawk got eaten by something else, guess what percent of the energy from the grass would go into 0.1%. So you see it's getting 10 times smaller every time. So it's not much energy. So actually if something eats the hawks, it either has to be a very small organism or has to eat a lot of hawks to get enough energy. Okay. And of course, most of us were talking before about the fact that, hey, there's other food chains you can make here. The grass gets eaten by the rabbit gets shot and eaten by the human, that sort of thing. So there's other ways that you can put all this together. Okay, you could start it with, say, lettuce being eaten by a rabbit, and then so on. Okay, so there's lots of possibilities. Right, we have to talk about this one here, the grass and all those plants that they start with being producers. Anything that eats something else is what we call a consumer. So consume and eat mean pretty much the same thing. They can be classified as different things. Herbivore, which are things that only eat plants, so things that only eat producers or plants. Carnivores, things that only eat meat. So let's be more scientific. They only eat other animals. Very good. What about omnivore?
They eat both.
They eat both. Now human and goats are very good examples. Now, don't be confused with something like a dog, which you'll see eat grass.
Human and goats, did you say?
Yeah, humans and goats are omnivores because we get sustenance out of both. Sorry, not goats, I mean pigs. My apologies. Goats will eat everything. They shouldn't eat meat. So omnivores actually have to get the energy out of both of them. So humans and pigs are a very good example. I'm sorry, I mentioned goats and I shouldn't have. Goats are an example that will eat meat, but they shouldn't. You'll see dogs eat grass, but they actually get no energy out of the grass. All it does is help flush their system through. It's almost like a medicine for them. Okay? So what you need to be able to do is say what these arrows mean, and they mean two things. They show the energy flow. There's a little phrase you can remember. It's is eaten by. So the arrow direction is eaten by. So grass is eaten by rabbits. Rabbits are eaten by hawks. Okay. Now if we put a whole lot of these food chains together from one ecosystem, we make a food web, and we're going to learn about those briefly tomorrow. Okay, very quickly I want to teach you about a thing called photosynthesis, and then we'll be finished here. Okay, so at the start of the food chains we've got producers, things that produce their own food energy. Alright, so what we call chemical potential energy. And we've got plants and algae, and some really tiny versions of those are what we call phytoplankton, which we talked about, which I mentioned before. All of those have one thing in common. They can do this process called photosynthesis. And it happens in, if we're looking at plants, the leaves. In these tiny ones, algae and phytoplankton, they're only made up of 1 or 2 cells usually. So they're really tiny. So it happens in all of their cells. So it's the only way that they can actually function. What they do is they take carbon dioxide in from the air, they take water in up through their veins, so from the soil, and they get sunlight coming into their leaves as well. And you'll notice that leaves are normally what colour? Green. That's because they contain a chemical called chlorophyll, and these little things called chloroplasts, little things inside their cells, that are like little factories that actually make their own energy. It's almost like little batteries. So they take these 3 things in, and then out comes oxygen as a waste product. Just as well for us, because we need oxygen to live, don't we? Mm-hmm. So out comes the oxygen as a waste product. They don't actually need it yet. And glucose, which they do store. And they store it as a thing called starch, which you might have heard of. You might have heard of things like potato being high in starch. Glucose and starch are chemical energy. They're food for the plant, but sadly for the plant, good for us, they're also food for all consumers. So it makes glucose so that then the plant can grow, and normally they do the process to use this called respiration at night. They do it all day and all night. They mainly use respiration at night to grow. So the reason they make glucose is not to feed other animals. Not to feed animals, that's not the point. The reason they make glucose is for them to get bigger. Alright, so one of the things that gets confused is plants are these wonderful things that do this process, photosynthesis, for everyone else, They don't. They do it themselves. It's just everyone else exploits it. So eats the plant to get the good stuff out of it. Okay? So we can summarise photosynthesis like this. H2O, which is water, plus CO2, which is carbon dioxide, gets turned into food, because glucose and starch can be turned into other foods. Food plus oxygen, O2. And on top of the arrow we write sunlight. That's saying, look, sunlight's not a chemical, but it's needed for this to happen. And another thing I should have written there is chlorophyll, because that's the chemical that allows this to happen. So what do you need to know? Well, we've got a couple of pages in our slide pad, 126 to 127, which will be very good for you to get a better understanding of photosynthesis. And you need to have a look at those pages 196 and 197 to get an understanding of food chains, in case that was a bit hard for you to understand.